had so many good times on that side of the table.
Wheels on the table!
It was the #1 show in America. It made a leather jacket iconic, launched careers that are still going strong today, and gave a whole generation somewhere warm to go on Tuesday nights. And then, piece by piece, it fell apart. This is the rise and fall of Happy Days, why it was canceled at its peak.
It was my idea for you to ask her to watch television. I aced myself out.
I feel rotten, Potsy.
Where it all began. Before there was a show, there was a pilot that nobody wanted. In 1971, producer Gary Marshall put together a small, gentle comedy set in the 1950s about a Milwaukee family getting their first television set. He called it New Family in Town. The cast included Ron Howard as Richie Cunningham, Marion Ross as his mother Marion, Anson Williams as his best friend Potsy, and Harold Gould as Howard Cunningham, a role that would later be recast with Tom Bosley. A BC looked at it, passed on it, and filed it away. Rather than let it disappear entirely, the network recycled it as a segment on their anthology series, Love American Style, airing on February 25, 1972, under the title Love and the Happy Days. The episode was about the Cunningham family's first television set and how Richie and Potsy attempted to use it to attract girls. It aired, generated no serious interest, and seemed destined for the permanent archive of almost shows. That might have been the end of it, if not for George Lucas. While developing American Graffiti in 1972, Lucas was looking for the right young face to anchor his film about teenagers cruising in early 1960s California. He screened Marshall's forgotten pilot and found in Ron Howard exactly what he needed: a clean, relatable, genuinely likable young man who conveyed a specific kind of American innocence without sentimentality. Howard got the part. American Graffiti was shot on a budget of roughly $750,000 and became one of the highest-grossing films of 1973, earning 5 Academy Award nominations and generating an enormous wave of 1950s nostalgia across the country. ABC, newly aware of the audience's hunger for that era, went back to Gary Marshall and asked him to turn his old pilot into a full television series. Happy Days premiered on ABC on January 15, 1974, as a mid-season replacement. Tom Bosley replaced Harold Gould as Howard Cunningham, the steady, decent father running a hardware store in Milwaukee. Marion Ross remained as Marion Cunningham, warm and sharp in equal measure. Ron Howard's Richie Cunningham was the center of the early seasons, a clean-cut, earnest teenager navigating high school life with his friends Potsy Weber, played by Anson Williams, and Ralph Malph, played by Donnie Most. Howard, who had practically grown up on American television playing Opie Taylor on The Andy Griffith Show from 1960 to 1968, brought a natural ease to the character that made him immediately believable. And somewhere on the edges of that first season, a supporting character named Arthur Fonzarelli, Fonzie, appeared in a gray cloth windbreaker, quiet and watchful, saying very little. Nobody yet knew what that character would become.
That night, none of this would have happened.
Marion, don't blame yourself.
I'm not. I'm blaming you.
The slow start and the big pivot. The first 2 seasons of Happy Days were filmed like a small movie. Single camera, no studio audience, a careful and somewhat restrained approach to the comedy. The show finished its first season at number 16 in the Nielsen ratings, which was a respectable result for a mid-season premiere. But in the second season, the numbers began to slide. The show was placed in direct competition with the Norman Lear spin-off Good Times on CBS, a show that was itself enormously popular, and Happy Days consistently came out on the losing end of that Tuesday night battle. Faced with a show that was quietly faltering, Gary Marshall made two decisions that changed everything. The first was a production change. Starting with season 3, Happy Days switched from its single-camera filmed format to a 3-camera setup in front of a live studio audience. Marshall had used the same strategy to rescue The Odd Couple from a first-season slump earlier in his career. And he understood what it could do for a cast. The energy from a real crowd in the room fed into the performances in a way that no laugh track could replicate. The actors played to that reaction, and the comedy opened up. The show that had been measured and quiet became something looser and more immediate. The second change was more consequential. Henry Winkler's Fonzie had been growing in popularity with viewers almost from the start, but the network had kept him under particular constraints. LBC had originally decreed that Fonzie should wear a cloth jacket, not a leather one. A leather-jacketed motorcycle rider, they felt, sent the wrong signal to family audiences. Marshall had negotiated a specific compromise. Fonzie could wear the leather jacket when he was near his motorcycle, so in the early seasons, the character was rarely seen without his bike. As the show retooled for season 3, those constraints quietly fell away. Fonzie wore the leather jacket everywhere. He moved out of wherever he had been living and into the apartment above the Cunningham family's garage, making him a permanent part of their household. And the show began building more and more of its stories around him, while Ron Howard's Richie Cunningham gradually shifted from protagonist to supporting player in his own show. The network, seeing the audience's response to Fonzie, pushed to rename the series entirely. Fonzie's Happy Days was the proposed title. Both Henry Winkler and Ron Howard pushed back against it. Winkler told the network it was an insult to everyone he worked with. Howard said privately that he would rather go back to film school than appear in a show called that. The name stayed, but the balance of the show had shifted, and everyone involved knew it.
I'm a singer.
You're boring.
Oh, you've already met Popsy.
The Peak, #1 in America. By the 1976 to 77 season, Happy Days was the #1 program on American television, ending all in the family's remarkable 5-year run at the top of the Nielsen ratings. It held a position in the top 5 for 3 consecutive seasons. It was the kind of dominance that only a handful of shows in television history have managed, and it happened for reasons that, looking back, make complete sense. America in the mid-1970s was not an easy place to be. The country had emerged from Watergate, from the withdrawal from Vietnam, through an oil crisis, through a succession of anxious and exhausting years. The cultural confidence of the post-war decades had curdled into something more uncertain and more suspicious. Into that atmosphere, Happy Days offered something that felt increasingly rare: uncomplicated warmth. It did not challenge the audience or confront them with difficult truths. It asked only that they sit down with the Cunninghams for 30 minutes and remember, or imagine, a time when life had been simpler and the stakes had been manageable. The 1950s Milwaukee the show depicted was not a fully accurate picture of the era. It was a curated version, cleaned up, stripped of the tensions that had actually defined the 1950s. But that was precisely its appeal. The show was not trying to teach anyone anything. It was trying to feel good. Fonzie himself had become something beyond a television character. By the late 1970s, his face was on lunchboxes, posters, and trading cards. His leather jacket was acquired by the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in 1980, while the show was still on the air and still pulling large audiences. Children who had never ridden a motorcycle were doing the Fonzie thumbs up in school hallways across the country. Henry Winkler, who had come to Hollywood after training at the Yale School of Drama with ambitions towards serious dramatic work, found himself one of the most recognizable faces in American popular culture. He handled it with unusual grace, consistently refusing to let the show be renamed around his character, insisting that he remain credited at the end of the main cast rather than at the beginning, out of respect for Ron Howard. He understood that the ensemble was what made the show work, even as his own star rose considerably above it. It was in this moment of total dominance that the first visible fault line appeared.
Jesting was a joke. So, you're not upset about...
Hollywood and the Shark. On September 20th, 1977, the season 5 premiere of Happy Days aired. It was a 3-part episode that sent the main characters on a trip to Los Angeles, itself a signal of where the show's instincts were heading, taking the Milwaukee gang out of Milwaukee and into a sunnier, more spectacular setting. In the 3rd part, Fonzie accepted a dare from a local rival known as the California Kid, and, wearing his trademark leather jacket over swim trunks, jumped over a confined shark on water skis. The episode drew more than 30 million viewers. By any measure, it was a hit. The idea for the stunt had its own backstory. It came from Winkler's own father, who had urged him for years to tell the producers that he was a skilled water skier. Winkler eventually passed the message along. Gary Marshall wrote the scene. Winkler did all the water skiing himself, except for the actual jump, which was performed by professional stunt skier Ricky McCormick. Don Most, who played Ralph Malph, was vocal on set that the whole thing felt wrong. Ron Howard remembered Most saying the show had devolved into something unrecognizable and unfunny. Howard recalled telling him to relax. They were a hit. It was hard to sustain great episodes every week. 8 years later, in 1985, a University of Michigan student named John Hine coined the phrase "jump the shark" during a late-night conversation with his roommate Sean Connolly about the moment their favorite television shows had started to go downhill. The roommate's answer about Happy Days gave Hine the phrase that entered the language permanently. Hine later built a website around it. The phrase was picked up by journalists and critics, and it moved from dorm room slang into everyday usage. It now describes the moment a television show, or any creative enterprise, crosses from genuine confidence into something more calculated, from invention into spectacle. Fred Fox Jr., the writer of that episode, pushed back against the characterization for decades, and was not entirely wrong to do so. The show continued to find substantial audiences for several years after, but the people who identified that episode as a symbolic turning point were also not wrong. The shark jump did not end Happy Days. It did, however, mark the moment when the show's instincts began shifting, away from the recognizable, grounded world of the Cunningham family in Milwaukee, and toward a version of the show in which Fonzie's ability to do increasingly improbable things was expected to carry the weight. The episode drew more than 30 million viewers, but some of those viewers left afterward with a feeling they could not quite name, and Don Most had given it voice before the cameras had even stopped rolling.
I'm me, and you're not.
Josh, will you relax our pledge period?
The Fonzie problem. Over the course of the late 1970s, the character of Fonzie went through a gradual but steady transformation that quietly changed the nature of the show around him. The early Fonzie had been a high school dropout and motorcycle mechanic, cool in the specific way that only someone genuinely unbothered by social approval can be. He had his own code. He operated outside the mainstream, and he was funny precisely because his world and the Cunninghams' world kept bumping into each other in unexpected ways. Richie was the lens through which the audience understood Fonzie. Fonzie was the lens through which Richie saw the world beyond his front door. That relationship was the engine of the show's best seasons. As the years passed, the character accumulated responsibilities and respectability. He became a teacher at the local school. He became a landlord. He became a father figure to younger characters. He became the person the Cunningham parents turned to for advice. He became, in some episodes, almost supernaturally capable, a figure who could always produce the right wisdom, make the right call, and arrive at the right moment. The idea that this was a guy who had once been the neighborhood's dangerous dropout became increasingly difficult to hold in your mind while watching him dispense carefully balanced moral lessons week after week. Henry Winkler was aware of this drift and said so on various occasions. He was not entirely comfortable with the direction the character had taken, and in interviews across the years, he spoke candidly about the tension between what the audience wanted from Fonzie and what he felt the character could honestly sustain. But audience demand and network pressure both pointed the same way. More Fonzie, and a Fonzie who could be heroic and wise in an ever-widening range of situations. The character who had been most interesting as an outsider slowly became the show's establishment and lost something irreplaceable in the process.
Good night, passion fruit!
The departures begin. In 1980, Ron Howard left Happy Days after season 7. He had been growing increasingly restless throughout the later seasons, quietly developing his interest in directing and producing while still showing up as Richie every week. He had already directed a feature film, Grand Theft Auto, in 1977. He wanted to move fully into that world, and ABC's refusal to take him seriously as anything other than Richie Cunningham had become a genuine frustration. He later recalled the network treating him with disrespect financially and personally, and feeling like someone who had outgrown the room he was standing in. When NBC's Fred Silverman offered him a contract, Howard made his decision. He described it afterward as a choice he never second-guessed. At the end of season 7, Richie Cunningham and Ralph Malph, Donnie Most had also decided to move on, were written out of the show by having them enlist in the United States Army and ship out to Greenland. It was a clean exit, but what it left behind was a structural problem the show never fully solved. Howard had been the stable center around which every other character moved. Richie's decency and earnestness had been the point of contrast that made Fonzie's cool feel like something. Without Richie to bounce off of, the Fonz became less interesting, a figure of authority without the person he was supposed to be guiding. The show restructured itself around Fonzie and the younger generation of characters, particularly Scott Baio's Chechi and Aaron Moran's Joni. Ted McGinley was added to the cast as Roger Phillips, Marion's nephew, to serve as a new anchor for the ensemble. He was a competent actor, but the show had moved a long way from what it had been, and no amount of casting could replace what the original ensemble had built over 7 years. The chemistry that made Happy Days feel like a real community, the specific warmth between Howard, Winkler, Most, Williams, and Moran had depended on those particular people being in the same room together. Scott Baio and Aaron Moran were spun off into their own series, Joni Loves Chachi, in 1982. It lasted 2 seasons before being canceled, and both returned to Happy Days for its final year. In the meantime, the show had been running with a version of itself that even its most loyal viewers recognized as diminished.
Shane, then we'll talk.
The competition closes in. By the early 1980s, the cultural landscape that Happy Days had been built for was shifting in ways that no retooling could fully address. The show was set in the 1950s, or what it loosely imagined the 1950s to be. And for the baby boomers who had grown up in that era and spent the 1970s watching Happy Days with their own children, the nostalgia had been genuine and powerful. It spoke to something real in them, the memory of simpler social rules, of a time before the upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s had reshaped everything. But as the 1980s arrived, that generation was aging out of the core television demographic, and a new generation of viewers was growing up without the same emotional connection to the world the show depicted. The warmth that had always been the show's greatest asset began to feel to younger audiences like something that belonged to someone else's past. At the same time, the show faced new and serious competition. For its final 2 seasons, NBC's The A-Team, which premiered in January 1983, was airing on Tuesday nights in direct opposition to Happy Days. The A-Team finished the 1982-83 season at number 10 in the Nielsen ratings. Happy Days finished at number 28. The gap told the story clearly enough. For 10 consecutive seasons, Happy Days had led ABC's Tuesday night lineup at 8 p.m. For its final season, it was moved to 8:30 p.m., half an hour later, replaced at its old time slot by a new show. A scheduling change that announced, without quite saying so, that the network's confidence in the series had reached its end. When the ratings came in for the 1983-84 season, Happy Days had fallen to number 63, from number 1 in the country to 63 in roughly 6 years. ABC decided there would be no 12th season.
So now I find out that it was a big tease.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, really? Here's something else you don't.
The finale and what it left behind. The series finale, Passages, aired on May 8, 1984. It was an hour-long episode built around the wedding of Joni and Chechi, which gave Bayo and Moran the send-off their characters had earned. Ron Howard returned as Richie, back from California, where he had been pursuing his dream of becoming a screenwriter, a neat mirroring of Howard's own departure from the show 4 years earlier. A subplot followed Fonzie through an adoption process for a young orphaned boy he had been mentoring, a storyline that, in its quiet way, acknowledged how far the character had traveled from the threatening greaser of the first season. The ending was warm, and the warmth felt earned. Potsy and Ralph were not at the wedding. Anson Williams and Donnie Most did not appear in the finale, but their absence was noted in the script, the show's way of acknowledging that the original family had scattered. 5 episodes that ABC had not been able to air during the regular season, the schedule had been disrupted by the Winter Olympics, were broadcast over the following summer. The very last, Fonzie's Spots, aired in syndication on September 24, 1984. With that, Happy Days was done. 11 seasons, 255 episodes, 7 spin-off series, 2 of which, Laverne and Shirley and Mork and Mindy, became major hits in their own right. Laverne and Shirley, starring Penny Marshall and Cindy Williams as 2 brewery workers in Milwaukee, premiered in 1976, and within a year was itself the number 2 show in the country, just behind Happy Days in the Nielsen rankings. Mork and Mindy gave Robin Williams his first sustained national platform and ran from 1978 to 1982. The phrase, "jump the shark," born from a single water skiing stunt on a Tuesday night in September 1977, became a permanent part of the English language, still in active use today to describe the moment any creative enterprise mistakes spectacle for substance. Henry Winkler's leather jacket sat in the Smithsonian. Ron Howard went on to direct Splash, Cocoon, Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, and a long list of films that established him as one of the most successful directors of his generation. Tom Bosley and Marion Ross, Howard and Marion Cunningham, became two of the most recognizable television parents of the era. Erin Moran struggled in the years after the show ended and died in 2017 from complications of throat cancer at the age of 56. Donnie Most went on to direct and perform in theater. Anson Williams moved behind the camera as a director. And Henry Winkler, who had arrived at the role wanting to do serious dramatic work, and found instead that he had become the most merchandised character on American television, built a second act as a producer, director, children's book author, and eventually an Emmy-winning actor for his work on Barry, a career that turned out to be far richer than a leather jacket alone might have suggested. Some shows know when to stop. Happy Days was not one of them, and in fairness, it is very hard to know when you are living through your own peak. The audience kept watching out of habit and loyalty long after the magic had faded, which is its own kind of tribute to how much the show had meant during its best years. It was genuinely loved, and in its early seasons, it was genuinely great at what it set out to do, which was to make people feel, for 30 minutes a week, that the world was warmer and simpler than it actually was. There is nothing small about that. What it built during those years, the careers, the catchphrases, the spin-offs, the cultural shorthand, outlasted the show itself by decades. And what it lost along the way tells its own story about what happens when a network falls so completely in love with its own success that it cannot resist the impulse to keep pushing until there is nothing left to push. The rise and fall of Happy Days is, in the end, one of the clearest illustrations television has ever offered of both possibilities. If this kind of story is what you're here for, hit the like button and subscribe. There's plenty more where this came from. We'll see you in the next one.